This is the second video in our series on the scientific method, where we're looking at how we would approach a problem from the process of using the scientific method and how we would design an experiment. So in the last video, after we developed our hypothesis, we had to test that hypothesis, and we test that in science using an experiment. Now, there are terms we use when setting up that experiment called designing an experiment that all are of the category of variables. And so what we want to do today is we want to look at the different variables in an experiment and how we would apply those as we're designing our experiment. So the key when you design an experiment is to isolate the experiment so that you're testing two variables. So remember, our big thing here is we want to isolate everything else except the two variables. Isolate everything else except the two variables being tested. And the two variables that are being tested are called the independent variable and the dependent variable. Everything else that is not the independent and dependent, we have to do what is called controlled. So let's say I'm going to conduct an experiment and I'm going to run 7 trials for that experiment. From one trial to the next, to the next, to the next. Everything except for these two has to stay the same. Why is that? Well, if we don't control the variables that we're not testing, we enter into our experiment uncertainty. So if I'm wanting to analyze this variable, but I change two things, I don't know if the change in my variable was due to the change in this or the change in that. So that's why it's really important to have everything isolated down except for these two variables. So the two variables that we're testing are called the independent and the dependent. The independent variable is what you as the tester decide to change, and the dependent is what you measure or is the result of the independent. So the independent variable is the variable that is changed by the tester or the conductor of the experiment. So I'm just going to call it the tester, conductor. I have a little mnemonic to remember this. So if you imagine a scientist sitting at a lab bench conducting an experiment, he is the tester. So he decides what, or she decides what the independent variable is going to be. And if any of you are fans of the Indiana Jones movies, you know they call them Indy. So I always picture a little scientist with an Indiana Jones hat on, deciding how to conduct the experiment. So Indy decides what variable we're going to change. The dependent variable is what we are looking at as a result or what is being measured. So the dependent variable is the variable that is being measured. We could say it's the result of the independent. It results from the independent. Results from the independent. So the controlled variables are everything else besides the independent and the dependent. They have to stay the same between all of the trials. So these are all other variables that have to be the same from trial to trial. Or constant. We could say they must be constant. Must be constant from trial to trial. Now we're going to look at 2 examples here and analyze what are our independent, dependent, and controlled. So our first example is a kind of a common high school lab. Students want to determine what spot in the school is the dirtiest by swabbing the surface and testing the amount of bacteria that grows on an agar plate. So the dirtier the surface, the more bacteria grow. And what students will commonly do is they will take this agar plate and they will divide it into 4 sections. So they'll just draw a line down the middle into their agar on the bottom of the plate. So they'll flip the plate over and they can draw on the bottom and they'll write, okay, so here we tested a cell phone. And here we tested a locker handle. And here we tested the toilet. You'll notice that this section's blank. This serves as a control. And we'll talk about why in a second. So, by the way, these, and I'm going to go ahead and do my slide now. I'm going to slide this down. Give me a second here. These are not uncommon results. Everybody thinks the toilet's going to be the dirtiest, and usually the dirtiest is a cell phone. How do we know it's the dirtiest? Well, we're seeing that we've got a lot of bacteria here. So, what are my independent, dependent, and controlled variables? Take a second and see if you can figure that out. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, so what do you think? What is it that we're measuring? So the amount of bacteria here is what we're measuring. So this is going to be the dependent. Well, where are we measuring? We're measuring different spots. So the spots in the school is going to be the independent. And you might run usually we'll set up in my class, we'll take different groups and we might have 15 different tests that we run. So what's up with this guy right here? Why do we have this section with nothing in it? Well, imagine after you're done growing your bacteria, you pull it out and you've got spots here. But you didn't use a swab. So what students will do is they'll come in and they'll swab these sections. They'll rub it on the cell phone, then they'll rub it in this section. They'll rub it on the locker, the Q-tip, and then rub it in this section. So what if you pull out your plate and you've got spots on your control section? Well, doesn't that imply that you were contaminated? So in this case, the control is actually the area that is not swabbed. So the non-swabbed area is our control. And if we end up with bacteria here, we know that there was some kind of contamination on this plate, and these results may not be valid. So there, again, we're introducing that second variable where we're looking at not only dirtiness in the school, but we're looking at contamination on a plate. So these trials aren't valid. That's why the control is so important. Okay, let's look at another example. For a class experiment, 2 students are asked to determine which paper towel brand is the strongest. They will measure how many marbles a wet paper towel can hold before it tears. What I would like you to do is to pause the video and see if you can determine the independent, dependent, and see if you can list some of the controls. All right, welcome back. What did you think? Well, if you're looking at a problem and you see they will measure, whatever comes right after that is going to be your dependent. So they're using their dependent is going to be the number of marbles that the wet paper towel can hold. And the independent is going to be what they're changing from trial to trial is which paper towel brand. So they're going to do, it's going to be the independent. Maybe they're going to test Bounty and they're going to test Great Value brand and they're going to test, shoot, I don't know any other paper towels off the top of my head, but the school paper towels, those brown towels you have that seems like it just pushes the water around and it doesn't absorb anything. So what do they have to control? Well, if they're going to wet that paper towel, they have to control how wet it is. So they have to control the amount of water used to wet. AMOU, amount of water. How about the size of the paper towel? If they use different sizes of paper towels, won't that introduce an uncontrolled variable? So they would have to control the size of the towel. Did you think of any more? You could probably list, golly, a half dozen here. The same marbles from trial to trial. So you don't want the big, Boss marbles, and then the little tinier, the smaller marbles. So it has to be the same type of marbles. And we could go on and on for these controlled, but we have to keep everything else the same so that we can measure our independent and our dependent. So what are our takeaways here? anytime you start to think about testing a hypothesis, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to think very carefully about your variables and make sure that you only have one independent and one dependent variable, and you're controlling everything else. So what we'll do in the next few videos that follow is we're going to look at, as we're collecting data, what are we going to do with that data? Is it better to use a table or a graph? And if you haven't yet, how do you create graphs using Google Sheets? Okay, that's it for variables. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.